August 1972. 400 feet below the freezing surface of the Sea of Okhotsk, two American divers clung to life through rubber hoses no thicker than a garden hose. One malfunction, one tear in those lines pumping warm water into their suits, and they would have less than 3 minutes before the near-freezing ocean turned them into corpses. Above them, resting on the seafloor like a steel leviathan on giant extendable legs, sat USS Halibut, a nuclear submarine that had ventured deep into Soviet territorial waters on a mission so dangerous that even its own crew didn't know the full truth. The divers were searching for something invisible in the darkness. A communication cable barely 5 inches wide, buried somewhere in the sand and silt of this heavily guarded Soviet sea. They had no idea why Command wanted this cable. They'd been told it was an oceanographic equipment test, but every sailor aboard understood one undeniable fact: you don't risk starting World War III for a training exercise. This is the story of Operation Ivy Bells, the most successful intelligence operation of the Cold War, and USS Parche, the submarine that became the most decorated ship in American naval history, without ever firing a single torpedo in anger. It began not in the ocean depths, but in the offices of American intelligence, where analysts faced a seemingly impossible problem. How do you listen to conversations happening 10,000 miles away, in waters so heavily defended that any intrusion could trigger nuclear war? In the early 1970s, America's intelligence community confronted a critical gap in their understanding of Soviet military capabilities. The Soviet Pacific Fleet, headquartered in Vladivostok and operating from bases on the remote Kamchatka Peninsula, controlled some of the most dangerous weapons on Earth: nuclear-armed submarines capable of launching ballistic missiles at American cities. The Sea of Okhotsk, which the Soviets considered their own private lake, was virtually impenetrable. Anti-submarine nets stretched across key passages. Acoustic listening stations monitored every unusual sound. Surface ships and patrol aircraft constantly swept the area. Any foreign submarine detected in those waters faced immediate destruction. But American intelligence had discovered something extraordinary. The Soviets had laid undersea communication cables connecting their bases on Kamchatka with fleet headquarters in Vladivostok and ultimately with Moscow. These cables carried orders, coordinates, intelligence reports, data about ship movements and weapons tests. Everything that made the Pacific Fleet function flowed through those wires on the ocean floor. Most remarkably, Soviet commanders were so confident in the security of their territorial waters that they often transmitted sensitive information without encryption. They believed it was physically impossible for anyone to tap a cable lying on the bottom of a sea ringed with defenses. That belief became their greatest vulnerability. The concept originated with Captain James Bradley, whose idea seemed like pure fantasy when he first proposed it. Send a submarine into the heart of Soviet defenses, land it on the seafloor next to the cable, deploy divers to install a recording device, retrieve the recordings monthly, and never get caught. The plan received the codename Ivy Bells, and it fell to a joint task force combining the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and the U.S. Navy. Many considered it a suicide mission. The first submarine chosen for this impossible task was USS Halibut, specially modified for covert operations. In August 1972, Halibut successfully penetrated Soviet defenses and reached the target area approximately 40 miles off the Kamchatka coast. Using a specialized towed camera system called the Fish, the crew located the cable at a depth of roughly 400 feet. Now came the truly dangerous part. Divers had to exit the submarine, work in near-total darkness in water barely above freezing, and install a massive recording device without damaging the cable itself. Any cut or puncture would allow seawater to contact the internal wires, potentially alerting Soviet engineers that something had gone wrong. The solution was inductive tapping. The device, which sailors called the pod, would wrap around the cable and detect electromagnetic fields generated by signals passing through, without ever penetrating the protective coating. But the divers faced another challenge. The signals were too weak to detect unless the pod was placed directly next to one of the amplification stations the Soviets had installed along the cable route. Finding these amplifiers in the murky depths required multiple dives over consecutive days. The divers worked tethered to halibut by lines carrying not just oxygen, but a specialized mixture of helium and other gases that allowed them to function at extreme depth. More critically, those same lines pumped heated water into their suits, the only thing preventing hypothermia in the frigid ocean. Before you click away, make sure you're subscribed to Orders of History and hit that like button. We're uncovering the most incredible classified military operations that shaped our world, stories that remained secret for decades. When halibut finally surfaced and returned to base, the intelligence haul exceeded every expectation. The pod had captured hundreds of hours of Soviet naval communications, much of it completely unencrypted. Translators and analysts discovered details about new missile tests, submarine patrol routes, weaknesses in air defense systems, even personal conversations between high-ranking officers. The Soviets had handed America a window directly into their most sensitive military operations. For several years, halibut made regular trips to service the tap, replacing recording tapes and maintaining the equipment. But by the mid-1970s, the submarine was aging. Years of extreme-depth operations had worn down her hull and systems. The Navy needed a replacement. They chose USS Parche, a Sturgeon-class attack submarine commissioned in 1974 as a conventional hunter-killer boat designed to track and destroy Soviet subs. What happened next transformed an ordinary warship into something unprecedented in naval history. When Parche arrived at the California shipyard for modifications, workers immediately erected special camouflage screens to hide the work from Soviet spy satellites. The engineers who came aboard held security clearances so high that most Navy officers didn't even know such programs existed. The transformation was radical. First, technicians cut a massive opening in the submarine's hull and installed what they called a moon pool, a pressurized chamber that allowed divers to exit directly from inside the sub without surfacing. This meant Parche could land on the ocean floor, open the lower hatch, and deploy personnel while remaining completely submerged and undetected. But the most unusual modification came next: retractable skids that engineers nicknamed the skis. 3 heavy support legs could extend from the hull, allowing the submarine to literally sit on the seafloor like a helicopter on a landing pad. This solved a critical problem. To work on the cable tap, divers needed a stable platform overhead. Parche could now descend directly over the target, extend her skids, shut down her engines, and remain motionless in complete silence while the specialists did their work. Additional modifications included maneuvering thrusters and extra control surfaces that gave Parche unprecedented agility. She could move sideways, rotate almost in place, and position herself with pinpoint accuracy over objects on the seafloor, maneuvers impossible for standard submarines. All these additions required sacrifices. Parche's torpedo capacity was reduced to make room for the specialized equipment. She was no longer primarily a weapon of war. She had become something else entirely: a silent intelligence collector. A ghost that could slip into the most heavily defended waters on Earth and extract secrets without leaving a trace. From 1976 onward, Parche took over the Ivy Bell's mission. Year after year, she returned to the Sea of Okhotsk, servicing the cable tap and delivering fresh intelligence to analysts stateside. The crew received medals and commendations, but no one could tell even their closest family members what they had actually done. The official cover story claimed Parche conducted oceanographic research, and that lie held perfectly. But Parche's missions expanded beyond simply listening. The Soviets regularly tested new anti-ship missiles over the Sea of Okhotsk, and American intelligence desperately wanted to examine the wreckage. After each test, Soviet recovery ships would sweep the impact zone and retrieve whatever they could find. But some debris inevitably sank into depths beyond the reach of conventional salvage operations. That's where Parche excelled. Using intercepted communications and satellite data, American commanders could predict where Soviet tests would occur. Parche would position herself in the projected impact area and wait. When a missile hit the ocean, the submarine would detect the acoustic signature and immediately navigate to the crash site. It became a race against time. Soviet search teams were also heading toward the same location, and Parche had to arrive first. Her divers would descend through the darkness, searching mud and rocks for any fragments of Soviet technology. Sometimes they recovered nearly intact missile sections. Other times, just circuit boards or scraps of metal. Every piece went into special containers and returned to naval research laboratories for analysis. One of the most significant finds involved debris from a supersonic anti-ship cruise missile that NATO designated the SSN-12. This weapon posed a serious threat to American aircraft carriers, but intelligence agencies disagreed about how it found its targets. Some experts believed it used radar guidance. Others insisted on infrared sensors. The distinction mattered enormously because different guidance systems required completely different defensive countermeasures. When scientists reconstructed the seeker head from pieces Parche had recovered, the answer became clear. The missile used only radar. No infrared capability existed. That single discovery reshaped the entire American approach to fleet air defense and allowed resources to focus on electronic warfare systems designed to jam radar-guided threats. One submarine dive and a handful of rusted components from the Sea of Okhotsk had accomplished more than thousands of hours of satellite surveillance and signals intelligence. Parche's operations weren't limited to Soviet Pacific waters. In the mid-1980s, she made multiple deployments beneath the Arctic ice, conducting reconnaissance near Soviet bases in some of the most dangerous submarine operations imaginable. Under-ice navigation meant that if something went wrong, the crew couldn't simply surface. Miles of frozen ocean sat between them and safety. Survival depended on finding rare polynyas, open water gaps in the ice sheet that had to be located using sonar and luck. The Barents Sea became another theater of operations. Soviet Northern Fleet headquarters and nuclear submarine bases required communication cables, and those cables crossed the Barents seafloor. Operating in these waters was even more hazardous than the Pacific missions, because Soviet anti-submarine forces in the north were considered the most capable in the world. Yet Parche repeatedly penetrated those defenses, executed her missions, and returned home undetected. Between 1987 and 1991, Parche underwent another major transformation at Mare Island Naval Shipyard. Engineers added a 100-foot extension to her hull just forward of the sail, a flat-topped section that resembled the missile deck of a ballistic missile submarine. This modification increased her length to over 400 feet and her submerged displacement to 7,800 tons. The extension housed additional crew quarters, bringing personnel capacity from 112 sailors to 179, and provided space for expanded signals intelligence equipment, navigation systems, and ocean engineering gear. The modifications also included armored spotlights, closed-circuit cameras, and forward-looking sonar for under-ice operations. The alterations significantly affected handling, particularly depth control, so engineers enlarged the hydroplanes on her sail and repositioned them higher to maintain maneuverability. Even with these changes, Parche reportedly handled poorly unless using her maneuvering thrusters. But by the time these upgrades were complete, the Cold War had officially ended. Most people assumed Parsh's mission was finished. They were wrong. In 1995, the Third Taiwan Strait crisis erupted when China launched ballistic missiles into waters surrounding Taiwan, attempting to intimidate the island democracy. While the world watched the crisis unfold on television, beneath the Taiwan Strait, America's most valuable intelligence asset was already at work. Parshe hunted for debris from Chinese missiles exactly as she had once pursued Soviet fragments. She recovered pieces of DF-15 and DF-21 ballistic missiles, providing American laboratories with crucial data about Chinese missile accuracy, reliability, and capabilities. That intelligence allowed strategists to assess the real threat China posed and develop effective countermeasures for any future conflict. Over 2 decades of service, Parsh accumulated more military honors than any other vessel in American naval history. 9 Presidential Unit Citations, the highest award a military unit can receive, equivalent to individuals receiving the Navy Cross. 10 Navy Unit Commendations. 13 Expeditionary Medals. 13 awards for battle efficiency. All without firing a single shot. All accomplished in absolute secrecy. But secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, can be destroyed by a single act of betrayal. Ronald William Pelton had worked for the National Security Agency for 14 years, translating and analyzing intercepted Soviet communications. He knew about Operation Ivy Bells. He understood its strategic value, and he possessed detailed knowledge of exactly where the cable taps were located and how they functioned. By 1980, Pelton's personal life had collapsed into financial ruin. He had filed for bankruptcy in April 1979 with debts exceeding $65,000, equivalent to roughly $250,000 today. When he left the NSA, he had only a few $100s in his bank account. On January 15, 1980, desperation drove Pelton to make a choice that would alter the course of intelligence history. He grew a beard to disguise himself, then walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and offered to sell what he knew. The KGB agreed to pay him $35,000 spread over 5 years. For someone with Pelton's debts, it was barely enough to survive. For the Soviet Union, it was the intelligence bargain of the decade. Pelton couldn't smuggle out documents because he no longer had access. But he possessed something prosecutors would later describe as a photographic memory. During extended debriefing sessions in Vienna in October 1980 and January 1983, KGB officer Anatoly Slavnov questioned him for 8 hours a day over multiple days. For these meetings, Pelton received $20,000 and $15,000 respectively. The relatively modest payments never resolved his financial problems, but they completely destroyed American intelligence operations. The first indication something had gone wrong came in 1981. Surveillance satellites detected multiple Soviet warships, including a salvage vessel, anchored directly over the location of the cable tap. USS Parsh was immediately dispatched to the site to retrieve the recording pod before the Soviets could examine it. When her divers reached the seafloor, they found nothing. The Soviets had already removed the device. Operation Ivy Bells had been compromised. American leaders scrambled to determine how the breach had occurred. The investigation would take years. Pelton wasn't arrested until 1985, after a Soviet defector named Vitaly Yurchenko provided information that helped investigators identify him. In 1986, he was convicted of espionage and sentenced to 3 concurrent life terms plus 10 years. He would eventually serve 28 years in federal prison before being released. Ronald Pelton died in September 2022 at age 80, having spent the final decades of his life in obscurity. But the damage he inflicted lasted far longer than his prison sentence. When the Soviets recovered that recording pod from the Sea of Okhotsk, they didn't just shut down one intelligence operation. They fundamentally altered their entire approach to communication security, implementing encryption protocols and security measures that closed off intelligence sources across multiple programs. Yet, even after the compromise, Parche continued her missions. The specific operations remain classified to this day, but we know she kept deploying, kept diving, kept bringing home intelligence that no satellite or listening post could obtain. USS Parche was decommissioned in October 2004 after 30 years of service. Parts of her sail are now displayed at the Naval Undersea Museum in Keyport, Washington, a small public acknowledgement of a submarine whose true history remains largely hidden. Most of her operational records are still classified. The full extent of what she accomplished may never be known. What we do know is this: in the silent depths of the world's oceans, beneath Soviet defenses that were supposed to be impenetrable, American sailors risked their lives on missions so secret that even today we can only glimpse fragments of the truth. They didn't seek glory. They couldn't speak about their work. They served in absolute silence, knowing that one mistake could trigger a war that would end civilization. And they succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one that destroys, but the one that listens. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, share it with someone who appreciates real history that sounds stranger than fiction. And drop a comment: did you know that the most decorated ship in U.S. Navy history never fired a shot in combat? We read every comment, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on these incredible Cold War operations that remained secret for decades.